This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Jacob Steven Mohr about his new anthology, Dead Letters, Episodes of Epistolary Horror. Jacob Steven Mohr does not believe in human consciousness. His works emerge as though from the ether, fully formed and fully ominous. Selections of these can be observed in Cosmic Horror Monthly, Shortwave Magazine, Chthonic Matter Quarterly, and The Best Horror of the Year, Volume 15. He exists in Columbus, Ohio. Follow him everywhere at Jacob Steven Mohr. Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Hi, good to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
If you could design your own roller coaster, what would it be?
That is a bigger question than maybe you originally thought. Other than being an editor extraordinaire, I am the biggest roller coaster nut that I know, and I actually have a ready-made answer for that question. I want to design the world's first jumping track-to-track coaster.
So you want to kill people, is what I'm hearing.
No. It's possible, I swear. Like, the math exists, and it wouldn't be on rails. There are some coasters that exist in a kind of a slide or a tube. It's like going down like a slide in a go-kart, essentially. It would just be that, and it would be calculated for the weight of the passengers in the car, and it would leave the ground temporarily. Yeah, some people would die, like, initially while we were working the kinks out, but, for science. And that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
In all of your past experience with roller coaster riding, you're like, you know what? If we could just launch and land somewhere else, that's what this is really missing.
Well, you ride enough of them, and for one reason or another, you stop being scared, right? You stop feeling in danger. And I think that's the reason that, depending on if you're riding roller coasters or you're reading horror, you are doing this to feel scared, to feel some thrill of danger. And once that wears off, you start seeking bigger and bigger thrills or scares. And I think the jumping coaster is the obvious culmination of all of that.
Do you have a name in mind for this jumping coaster?
That's a good question. I do not currently.
May I toss out a few?
You go for it. Let's workshop.
Jumping Jack, Spring Heel Jack, Hell's a Poppin'. We'll return to that if we have any more inspiration.
I'll be mulling that in the background for probably weeks, so thank you for that.
So tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I live in Columbus, Ohio. I was born and raised in Raleigh, North Carolina. I have been writing since probably 2010, and I only got into horror relatively recently in my career. I wanted to be a fantasy novelist for a long time. That's what I thought I was going to do. And then I got an idea in the middle of a different book. I got an idea for a horror short story that eventually became The Unwelcome, and I kind of never looked back after that.
Is there any overlap for you between that early love of fantasy and that newfound love of horror? Or do those increasingly feel like different countries?
I think there's certainly an overlap. What I was really striving for, especially very early in my career, I had this picture in my head of essentially like a scene or a formula for a scene that could create like maximum emotional impact. Eventually, I figured out that if you wanted to go for that maximum impact, you had to go primal, you had to go scary, you had to go horror. And I don't know if that's actually true, but it certainly felt true to me at the time. And I've kind of leaned into it, I suppose, since then.
Would you say that your horror has some fantastical elements?
Certainly. There's definitely a lot of crossover between what I write now and what I began writing initially, which was not so much fantasy, but magical realism. Realistic stories set in a realistic world that have magical elements that intrude onto them. So a lot of my stuff, it begins in a very ordinary world, and whatever scary element intrudes onto that ordinary world, quote unquote, always has a connection or like a metaphorical implication to the human interest in the story.
What were some of your horror touchstones?
I've always said to people, especially very, very early on, no Neil Gaiman, no me. His short fiction was always huge for me. I remember reading Trollbridge in Emma's for Magic as a very, very, very young author, and it changed my life.
Have you had a chance to check out the Graveyard book?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm continually shocked there is not a movie or like a Netflix animated series or something based off of that, because his worlds are so delicious and dark in a very inviting way. He captures nostalgic horror, I would say, better than any author working today.
I see in one version of your bio that you do some ad writing, producing, directing. And I also see on your Instagram that you perform readings of short stories and you make book trailers.
I do.
Does your day job help with this multimedia approach to some of your creative work?
It certainly does. There's not as much crossover as maybe you would think, but when I made the book trailer for The Unwelcome, for instance, I got very fortunate that I got to use some company resources and some company talent, especially like some very, very expensive cameras and lighting packages to make that. That took about a day in 2021 to make that. It's probably one of my favorite like film projects that I've worked on, just because I had complete control over it. It was something related to like something that I had made. I got to act in it. I'm not on camera very much. It was a real thrill to get to make that, and I wish I could do that again.
Are you ready to talk about Dead Letters?
Oh, you know it.
Congratulations on your #1 orange banner.
That was a real thrill. That was unexpected. Like I happened to go on Amazon, the day before, just to see. Whenever a new book comes out, you get there's an anxiety that comes with it. Like there's that nagging fear in the back of your head of like, what if Amazon took it out? What if something went wrong? What if somebody fucked something up? What if I fucked something up? And I've got all these people depending on me. I definitely felt this need to be observing all of that, and that's how I saw, oh shit, we're #1 for the epistolary category, for paperback for a little bit, for hardback for a little bit, and then back to paperback. It was just a very, very emotional couple of days, and we're still up there, so it's still very emotional, as you can maybe tell.
Dead Letters is a book of epistolary horror.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you decide to explore the epistolary format?
This was about a little over a year ago. I wrote a story called 1855, which was my first real foray into the epistolary genre. I don't know what made me decide to write it as a letter, but in the process of crafting that story, which ultimately became one of my maybe more well-known pieces, I really fell in love with the format and this idea of the voyeurism of the epistolary format. I've talked to a lot of people about this, where I think that part of the thrill of reading something in this genre, in this format, is that with any other prose, with like first person or third person, any other kind of story, the prose, the style exists for you, the reader. It is not so in epistolary. It has an intended recipient, shall we say, and it's not you. You're not supposed to be reading this, and it's not really meant to be a story. It's meant to be a different kind of communication. It becomes a story by the transgression of us reading it. We are doing something wrong. We are making it a story because we want to find narrative in it, because that's how our brains are wired. And so because people engage with it on this second higher level, it has the potential to enthrall people all the more. At least it certainly does for me. And that's why I decided, if I'm going to do an anthology, and I'd always wanted to do an anthology, that of course I'm going to choose the format that enchants me the most.
I feel like the shadow of H.P. Lovecraft looms large over the epistolary subgenre.
It certainly does.
There was a time when everyone wrote and received letters, and it just made sense that there'd be a lot of horror stories presented in that format. What's interesting now, where found footage is such a beloved subgenre, that we can apply this modern sensibility where we're no longer bound by things like diaries and quill written letters. We've got text messages, everything that puts out there, we now understand there's a copy of it somewhere that will live in perpetuity forever. every JPEG you send, it can all be gathered, especially in the aftermath of a mystery or a murder. It's like, well, let's look at the coroner's reports. Let's look at these letters to the editor. Let's look at Post-it notes found on mailboxes, things like that. There's so much more richness that can go into epistolary now. And a lot of this is reflected in the collection.
Sure. Like you were saying, the advent of the internet and digital communication and the way that human communication has rapidly evolved over even the last decade has really blown the lid off of what the epistolary genre is capable of. It used to be just letters, like you said, in the day of Lovecraft and Stoker and even Mary Shelley. It was letters, it was journals. Now, like you said, it's text messages, it's podcast transcripts, it's coroner's reports, it's anything and everything that's ever been archived digitally. It can be JPEGs, it can be scans of things. And so I think that the epistolary genre is going to, in a commensurate way, evolve. And I think that this anthology hopefully is going to be, at least a small part of that.
So there are 21 stories in Dead Letters. What was your philosophy in reading through and collecting these? How did you choose which ones you wanted to present, in what order, when you were building this anthology?
Building this table of contents was one of the hardest things that I've ever done as an author or an editor, because we got over 300 stories over 2 months, which I decided I needed to give my authors like a clear end date of, you will hear from me, yes or no, by this day. So I had to read all of these in about 2 months or so. And so my philosophy for just getting through all of that was, if I'm going to take a story for further consideration, it needs to not only be of high quality, as almost all the stories I received were, it needs to surprise me in some way. It needs to do something different and shocking with the format, and it needs to be a story that could not be told any other way. I think that there are, for people who are just starting out writing epistolary, there's this notion of like, you can take any story and then like translate it into the epistolary format. And there are many stories, some of which I've even written myself, that are like that, where like it didn't need to be this. But I really believe that every story in Dead Letters had to be epistolary or it wouldn't work.
What are some of the stories you would like to highlight? Because there's 21 of these. We can't, unfortunately, get to them all.
I would certainly want to highlight the authors who helped anchor this anthology. I invited 5, some who I consider to be close friends, some who are acquaintances, but all people I am greatly indebted to at this point, because you have to pitch this to a publisher, and having these names kind of in my pocket certainly help with that. And those are I. Jiang, Gordon B. White, Gemma Files, Red Lago, and J.A.W. McCarthy. Gemma Files wrote Echo Chamber, which is a lot of, like we were talking about before, like very internet archivey stuff. It's podcast transcripts and like forum notes. And it kind of is, it's one person's search for the audio version of a podcast transcript that she has, that she thinks has the only recording of a song written and performed by a very, very mysterious recording artist, that kind of delves into the process of recording and how that can change the meaning of art and how it influences us. And it goes in such bizarre and terrifying directions that it's actually a little bit difficult to describe. You just have to read it. And that's true of a lot of Gemma Files work, where like if you just describe it, it maybe won't sound as scary as it truly is, but there's something about her prose, there's something about the way her mind works and the way her pen works that, I don't know, there's really just nothing like it.
In this story, Echo Chamber, these internet sleuths are tracking down this lost plague song.
Mm-hmm.
That means they're delving through a lot of folklore and a lot of oral history. One of the references that came up in the course of this story was Sheila Chandra. And I was like, wait a minute, I remember Sheila Chandra. I'm just going to drop in a clip of her song, Singing My Ancestors' Voices here.
Taggadinnam tadikotaka janakukupatake kupatake taddin kotaka janakotadin kukupatake kupatake taddin kotaka janakotadin.
And then it said that she had retired from singing because she had something called burning mouth syndrome. And I was like, what the fuck? So that sent me down my own internet rabbit hole of learning about what happened to this incredible artist and that there's this thing called burning mouth syndrome that sounds horrifying. It's like her story pulled me into the dark swirl of it. Yeah.
This is the beauty of epistolary form, because it seems so real that like you feel drawn into it, you are participating in it on this other level. And of course that's also a strength of Gemma Files' work, is that like her stuff is so exhaustively researched that she will pull in these interesting tidbits that are not speculative necessarily, but are still horrifying. So you begin to pull your own research and your own knowledge into it. You're participating in the writing of the story along with her. And when you're that engaged, when you're that engrossed, how can you help but be scared?
Even without a single speculative element, the threads she pulls on are horrifying in their own right. Mm-hmm. So what's one of the other tent poles?
Let me tell you about Gordon B. White.
Bury my bones in the bastard who killed me.
Yes, this story. Definitely the only truly comedic piece in the anthology. I remember when I first got this in my inbox, because he submitted his fairly early, and I just wrote back to him in a Twitter DM, Gordon, what the fuck? What the fuck is this? What the fuck did you send me? All separate lines in the DM. And he just kind of laughed at me. And how do you even describe this piece? It's partly written in letters, partly written in notes attached to arrows that have killed people. There's stuff about wizards. There's stuff about D&D. There's a thing called the Toot Man. None of this is spoilers, by the way. You can't spoil this story. Like, I could tell you everything that happens in it, and you would still essentially be going into a blind.
I summarize this as a silly meta romp with format that one might expect from Gordon B. White.
Mm-hmm.
He is in top form here, doing what he does, playing with form in really surprising ways that eventually unveil a deeper narrative with an emotional core. Mm-hmm. Just when you think it can't get any sillier, he actually starts to find an emotion and bring it out, and you realize that you've been on that trip the whole time.
There's a very scary thing about going through all of that seeming senselessness and then having it actually make sense at the end. And you think to yourself, well, there's something wrong with me then, because this is actually starting to all come together.
Yeah, when it starts to make sense, you know you're in trouble.
I think I said in a different interview that it makes you want to get a grippy sock vacation.
Yeah, I absolutely loved his collection.
Let's talk about Ai's story next.
Dear Kelly by Ai Zhang.
Other than mine, I think it is the shortest story in the anthology. And also, like all the others, she plays with the format in this really unexpected way of, well, at first you think that, okay, this is classic epistolary, it's just letters, but it's not. It's letters that are being like crossed out and rewritten in real time, partly by a living twin, partly by a dead twin, and they are working together for this sinister purpose. But over the course of not that many words at all, like it unveils this deep sadness and dissatisfaction. Oh, it's really the story of someone who's hasn't been allowed to grieve, and this is the result, like the psychosis.
I gives you a little choice in the beginning, which is you can read through it all as the text. You can read through it all that is struck through, or you can read it all together in a mad jumble.
I like that she provides almost like a key.
It's like a choose your own adventure, because depending on which you read,
it really is
determines in which order you get the official surface level of the story, or what you are reading that has been buried and covered up.
Again, it makes you engage in a different way, because you're having to kind of squint at the physical words. And so when you're putting that much work into reading something, of course, I think you're going to get more out of it because you're paying that close of attention. I don't think I've ever read a story that had this many unreliable narrators in it. This family is screwed up. Red's story, of course, is unique because she brings her artistic abilities to the table, and it's the only illustrated story of the bunch.
So this is Red Lago's story drawn home.
It is definitely one of the more traditional narratives. It's very traditional epistolary of like letters sent home and a few conversations on internet forums as well. But there is this visual element to it because this is a story about an artist, and it had the added benefit of, it is the author also providing the art, which I thought was very, very unique.
The last anchor story in this collection is the Hand, open parenthetical, of God, close parenthetical.
I had the closest emotional connection with Jen's story. There is a real understanding of like modern, I don't know if it's specifically a millennial thing, but it's certainly people my age who experience this particular kind of profound loneliness in their lives. I think it's partly because of like the corporate cultures that we find ourselves kind of embedded in. It's partly because human connection as you graduate from college becomes so much more difficult as we kind of spread out across the country chasing careers and things and leaving the familial structures and friend groups that we had initially formed behind. But we find ourselves kind of adrift and invisible in these new places. This is, of course, a story about a woman who finds herself being very quickly erased from her own life. I didn't even understand it quite at first. When I was reading it to edit it, I got this overwhelming sadness because I identified with it so much, and I'm very grateful that she sent the story in because it really meant a lot to me.
Let's segue to your story, Berkey Family Vacation, 1988. What was your inspiration for this one?
There is a subgenre of found footage and found fiction called analog horror. I had just kind of discovered that. I was watching something on YouTube called Winter of 86, and I love this very, very lo-fi aesthetic of like stuff that's on old VHS tapes, stuff that was broadcast and then rebroadcast and compressed and warped. And I'm not quite sure where the actual like concept for the story came from. It's kind of like fell out of me as I was reading other stories for Dead Letters. I actually wrote this at the same time everyone else was writing theirs.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. It's like a gumbo of all the inspirations coming into the collection.
Oh, very much so. I don't do this for a lot of my stories, but for this one, I did try to write it in such a way that like it could be filmed as written. Like it does, I think, work as a screenplay.
This one is intensely visual.
Mm-hmm.
And those visuals just seamlessly leap off the page. If I think about this story, it actually plays as like a little movie in my head. Like I can't even think of it as a story like some of these other letters and diaries and transcripts and things. You really did manage to elicit that lo-fi vibe in a way that really played to the unsettling strength. There's an image in it where a little girl is cowering in a dark room. She's got her video camera on, and there's a shadow of a hand pressed against the window. And then it spreads apart to reveal 8 fingers. And like, that's all you get in that little bit. And I was like, ooh, like really effective. I hope you do film this because I think it's ready. I think it's fully cooked.
I would certainly like to. This was also one where, again, we were talking before about like, filming budgets and stuff. And I think I was very quote unquote budget conscious with this one. Like there's not a lot of effects. There's not a lot of shots you would need. I think I could film this in like a couple of days.
And it doesn't overstay its welcome. It's not like found footage horror movie conceit where the camera's running all the time and it captures all the backstory and fills in all the gaps. The camera flicks on and flicks off, and you get little tiny glimpses that fall like dominoes into this short, weird fiction story. Well done. Bravo.
There's the addition as well that this story or this footage that you're describing was broadcast at least once, which means that somebody had this footage. And there probably is like a longer version that has more backstory, but it was edited down by somebody. and run on TV once.
And that framing device, as we were talking about epistolary horror, every choice of format creates a frame which implies a narrative or is a gap in which there is some mystery. Like, why did it get uploaded to this chat room at all? Or why was this podcast file pulled? Why can't we find any mention of this one book or this one expedition? Another really good example of that is the Samhain tapes. This short, nasty piece of folk horror. And it's done as an anthropological field recording, but you realize that it's not happening in real time, and this is not a tape on a shelf. This is a tape that's being played over and over for different reasons. And the fact that you can loop the tape and it has different connotations. I'm being very vague here, but it's a really brutal and disturbing story.
I think there was a word you used before. Nasty. This is a nasty story. And it's full of nasty people. Like, it is, I would never call any of the stories the scariest one in the collection. This one is by far the most mean-spirited.
100%.
It hates all of its characters. It almost reminds me of an episode of It's Always Sunny and how much, like, it treats everyone just as despicable garbage.
Yeah, I mean, there's almost some disdain for the reader as well, who has to suffer through this.
Like that, you sick fuck, huh?
Yeah, it feels so contemporary as folk horror becomes more and more prevalent. I was like, ooh, the Samhain tapes. This will be nice and Halloweeny. That's my bag. And then I was like, I don't want this. This was very upsetting.
So claustrophobic.
It's so awful.
And this is one almost by design that would work so well as a podcast episode because it's written as just this one audio log.
Yeah.
Can you imagine listening to that with a good pair of headphones that pays attention to like the spatial separation between the ears? I would puke. I would puke. I would die. I would make a mess on the floor.
Yeah, it's that good.
The final word on the collection is read it, please. We all worked extremely hard on it. There are 21 stories in it. There's not a bad one in the bunch. We're all tremendously excited about this project, and we can't wait for all of you to get to read it.
Awesome. What are you working on next?
Well, truthfully, I would love to do another one of these. Not necessarily another Dead Letters or another epistolary horror, but I would love to do another anthology like this. It turns out I really adore working with my author peers. I've got the editing bug again, and I want to ride the coaster again.
The hell's a poppin' coaster?
It all comes back around, baby.
So where can our listeners find out more?
Goodreads is probably going to be your best bet. That's where all of my stuff is. It all kind of branches out from there. I'm at Jacob Steven Mohr, wherever you want to look.
Well, Jacob, thank you for hanging out with us today.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you having me on.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.
Can you imagine listening to that podcast episode? I would puke. I would puke. I would die. I would make a mess on the floor.
Yeah, it's that good.